Thank you so much, Julie, and it's an honor to be with folks from My Jewish Learning. It's always exciting to collaborate with My Jewish Learning from Hadar, and if you're interested in more about Hadar, you can just go to hadar.org, hadar.org, and there's tons of opportunities to continue learning with me or others from our faculty. So today we're going to look at the question of what is the Amidah, and what I'm really going to focus on is not only an opportunity to look at this prayer itself, but also an opportunity to understand how the prayer book in general works and how we might actually add more levels of meaning to reciting these words that often feel, for many of us, unrelated to our own state of mind or spiritual mindset. And the Amidah is a great prayer to engage in this question with, because the Amidah was the prayer that the rabbis invented sort of out of the blue, more or less, that they made required for everybody to say every day 3 times a day. So that is a high bar in terms of requirements. It was a prayer that was meant to be recited by Kol Adam, every single person, every day, 3 times a day, and a few extra times on certain holidays. And so in that way, it is in some ways a stand-in for what rabbis thought about prayer in general. In fact, the word for prayer that we refer to in Hebrew, tefillah, is a synonym for the Amidah. The Amidah is not the name of this prayer in rabbinic literature. The name of this prayer in rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, etc., is tefillah, which just shows you there's a deep synonymous nature between the prayer we're going to look at and prayer in general. Sort of capital P prayer is what we're going to look at. The main thing you need to know about the structure of the Amidah before we dive into the specifics of how it works and how we might interpret the words, the structure is one in which you basically have a certain number of blessings. Let's use the base case of a weekday. On a weekday Amidah, you would have 18 blessings, 3 in the beginning and 3 in the end, that are traditionally understood as praise in the beginning and thanks at the end. And in the middle, the sort of essence of the Amidah are a series of blessings, 12 blessings that are meant to be requests, or as I like to think of it, as statement of vulnerabilities. You know, where are my needs? Where are my lacks? Where are the ways in which I am not fully who I want to be? And so I need to express that in words and put that out there into the world and pray to God about that, depending on your theology. So that's the sort of basic structure of the Amidah. And those middle 12 blessings, which later in time became 13, which is a whole other story, but the middle blessings get subbed out on holidays and Shabbat. Instead of a series of requests, it's just one blessing that is praising God for the holiday that we're experiencing or Shabbat that we're experiencing, and is actually a great expression of, on holidays and Shabbat, we don't have needs, as it were, and we substitute all of our needs and requests and put in instead just an extra marking of the time. So the number of blessings is variable depending on the day that we are on. Now, in terms of how the Amidah came to be and when it was written, which words came at what point in Jewish history, all this is tons of ink. I have bookshelves full of books that are dealing with the question of how old is the Amidah, when were the words showing up. It's a big scholarly debate. It's actually my understanding, and I did a doctorate in liturgy, is that you can't really come to a hard and fast conclusion. And so what we're going to spend our time doing instead of a historical investigation, which may or may not yield any real fruits, we're going to do a literary investigation, which is to say we're going to have the opportunity to look at the words of the Amidah, or some of the words of the Amidah, and understand how those words function as prayers. And that's the challenge that we're going to have before us. So what I'm going to do in just a moment, and Julie maybe will drop again into the chat, the source sheet, I'm going to share it with you, and I'm going to set the stage a little bit in terms of deriving meaning from prayer and from the Amidah, and then we're going to do our literary work on the core text of the Amidah, which is the first blessing. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen now, and let's do this together. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. Okay, just give me a thumbs up if you can see the share. We good? Okay, great. So let me start off just by framing the question of what we're about to engage in, which is, how do I understand any prayer, and the Amidah specifically, in a framework of meaning as opposed to a framework of history or a framework of sort of textual archaeology. How does it mean something to me, especially if I didn't write the words and I may or may not understand what the words are driving at? So there is, of course, in modern Jewish history over the last 200 years, a main answer to the question of how do we understand our prayers for meaning is to rewrite the prayers until we make them meaningful enough for us to understand. And that is, of course, always an option that is available to us. I want to look at a different option, which was offered by Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he mentioned this option at a keynote speech he was giving in the 1950s at a conference of rabbis, where the subject of the conference was, how can we improve prayer in the suburban synagogue? And these are problems that in some ways persist. And this is his answer. He says, this is our affliction. We do not know how to look across a word to its meaning. We forgot how to find the way to the word, how to be on intimate terms with a few passages in the prayer book. Familiar with all words, we are intimate with none. The same word may evoke new understanding when read with an open heart. What we need is a sympathetic prayer book exegesis. Okay, so what is Heschel encouraging us to do? He's saying that, you know, for a lot of people, the words of the prayer book are familiar, but we actually have very little intimate connection with any of those words. How much the more so if you don't even have any, familiarity with the words. But what we need to do is actually read the words with a sympathetic prayer book lens, a sympathetic prayer book exegesis, an interpretation that opens the heart and allows for some sort of intimacy with words that are meant to be recited over and over again. So if this is a prayer that we recite minimum 3 times a day, we need to do the work to make those words not something that's just rote, but actually something that means something that is connected to us and has some sort of intimacy to it. And that's what our quest is going to be today. So I'm going to sort of take up Heschel's challenge. He unfortunately never did this in any detail, but we're going to try to take up this challenge and do a sympathetic prayer book exegesis of the first blessing of the Amidah here. And that's what we're going to dive into right now. I'm going to do, just in terms of taking questions, is that you're welcome to put questions into the chat. I'm going to stop the share at various points during our hour together. Look at your questions and try to respond to them there. And Julie can help if anything comes up. But basically, I will take your questions in the chat as we have certain breaks as we move through. Okay, I'm going to look at this prayer together with you. The first blessing of the Amidah. And the reason why I picked the first blessing is because actually in the Talmud, the rabbis have a debate about how much focus you're meant to have, how much intention you're meant to have for the Amidah. And their sort of high-level answer is you should have intention and focus for the entire Amidah. For every blessing of the 18 and later 19 blessings, you've got to really be focused and present. However, being practical, the rabbis also said, you know what, if you can't have intention for the whole thing, the minimum standard for having kavanah, for having intention or focus, is the first blessing of the Amidah. And so there's something about the first blessing of the Amidah that is essential to the entire project of the Amidah. And since we have an hour together, I think that's a good amount of time to look at one blessing as opposed to the whole gamut of the blessings, and that's what we're going to spend our time looking at here today. So what I'm going to do, and I invite you to do this together with me, I'm going to read out the blessing itself. I'll read it in the Hebrew and then in the English. And what I'm going to invite you to do is really to take the first step of interpretation, which is to ask questions. This is sometimes a hard thing for folks to do. That is to say, sometimes my question is masquerading as a comment or as an interpretation, but I'm actually going to encourage us to ask real questions. A question ends with a question mark and begins with a question word, like why or what. And that's the orientation I want us to take when we look at this paragraph together. I'm going to read it out loud. You'll ask as many questions that pop up into your head. It could be a big question, like what does it mean to bless God? Or a grammatical question or anything in between. You're invited to just take note of that internally or to put it in the chat so we can share these questions. And a good question doesn't need to have an answer, by the way. It's okay to ask a question that doesn't have a clear answer. And that's what we're going to do. So let me read the text in the Hebrew, then in the English, and you can come up with as many questions as you as you can. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov, Ha'el hagadol hagibor v'hanora, El Elyon, Gomel chasadim tovim, Bikonei hakol, Bizocher chastei avot, Umevi goel livnei b'neihem, Lema'an shemo bi'ava, Melech ozer umoshia umagen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Avraham. Okay, that's in the Hebrew. Now I'm going to read it in the English. By the way, the line numbers are my own arbitrary line numbers, so you don't have to read too much into that, but just for ease of reference. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God and God of our ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, the great, mighty, and awesome God, God Most High, who performs acts of loving kindness and creator of all, and remembers the loving kindness of our ancestors, and brings a redeemer to their children's children for his name's sake with love. Helping, saving, and shielding King, blessed are you, God, shield of Abraham. Okay, so I'm going to invite you to just put in as many questions as you want or as you care to in the chat, and I'll just sort of read out some of them as they come in. I should note, by the way, I didn't write this prayer, so if you like it or you don't like it, you can't blame me. Okay, so Leah's saying, where are the four matriarchs? Yeah, in line 2, we only have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By the way, in line 10, we only have Abraham. So where are the corresponding matriarchs, which of course were added to many Sikurim in the last 30 years, but they're not in the traditional text that we have here. Blessed are you. Does this mean that God is blessed? Leslie's asking. What does it mean for God to be blessed? So how can I understand that opening line? Is it a description? Am I doing something to God? That's a question that we're putting out there. Paul's asking, how do we know where interpretation ends and incorrect understanding begins? That is a great meta question, and you can ask it at the end of this class, and we're going to sort of try to put some goalposts on where interpretation is still within the bounds of possibility as opposed to whatever I feel must be the interpretation. Cheryl's saying, again, raising the question of the matriarchs, why are they here, or are they being ignored? Barry's saying, what's the shield of Abraham in line 10? God is shield of Abraham. What does that mean? There are many, many descriptions that we could have used for God in God's relationship to Abraham. So why do we use shield? Michael's saying, is a redeemer a reference to the Messiah? In line 8, who brings a redeemer to their children's children. So which redeemer am I talking about? Am I talking about literally their children's children, which could be the generation of Moses? And Moses is the redeemer? In that way, it's sort of like already in history? Or is there a future Messiah that's being referred to? Could it possibly be both? Marian's reminding us that the matriarchs are always mentioned in Reformed liturgy. Why repeat? Jennifer saying, why repeat God of, God of, God of? Yes, the great question. In line 2, even if you're okay with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob being there, how come we say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob? You could have just said God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That would have been a perfectly reasonable way to communicate the same essence. And so what is the deal with the extra God of there? Michael's saying, wasn't Atah Gibor taken out at some point? Atah Gibor is the next bracha, the next blessing. So we can look at that if my Jewish learning invites me back. What does his namesake mean? Marty's asking in line 8. What does it mean to say Lema'an Shemo? And by the way, I would add to that, how come Shemo, his namesake, is in third person, whereas everything else in this blessing is in second person? I'm directly addressing God in most of the blessing, but all of a sudden I switch to the third person, his namesake. What does that mean, and why is that important for God's namesake? Good. Abby's asking, is there any particular reason for the order of 5, 6, and 7? Right? 5 is who performs acts of loving kindness and creator of all, and remembers the loving kindness of our ancestors. In fact, as you're pointing out, 5 and 7 are better grouped together because 5 and 7 mention chesed, mention loving kindness. So how come they're separate there? Okay, this is an amazing list of questions. I'm going to just stop the share for 1 second so I can see your faces. It's an amazing list of questions, and we actually are expert. I would say I would give us an A+ in the first step of interpretation, which is to look at a prayer, ask questions. Again, questions don't need to have answers, but to just even have that orientation to what are the ways in which I am wondering about a prayer. That is an amazing step of what it means to take the first step into interpretation. We're going to return to some of your questions, and even the ones I didn't get to read out. We could probably spend the whole session just reading your questions. I love doing that because it's always clear that people are reading with a really fine and curious eye. But I want to take us to the next step, which is the question of interpretation. And one of the questions was, well, what are the boundaries of interpretation? So this is what I want to put out there in terms of just orienting us to that project, which is a statement from Reuven Kimmelman. You'll see it on the first page of the source sheet, and I'll just summarize his quote. Reuven Kimmelman is a professor of rabbinics at Brandeis, and what he says is, if you're going to interpret the Siddur, if you're going to interpret the prayer book, you need to know something very important, which is to say that the prayer book is only one part of the project. In fact, there is always a second text that stands behind the Siddur. If this is the Siddur, this is the text that stands behind the Siddur, which is the biblical intertext, the Bible text that stands behind the Siddur and is being quoted by the Siddur. And Kimmelman says, you can really only understand the Siddur if you put it up against the biblical intertext. When you have those two texts together, the meaning is created in the space between those two texts rather than, what do I think about this one text over here in this one plane? So that sounds a little theoretical. We're going to dive into it practically, and you're going to see what I mean. And I actually want to start off with the question, which is sort of a hybrid question of, how come Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are mentioned, but the matriarchs aren't mentioned? And I think we've in some ways been conditioned to say, well, where are the matriarchs? But you could also ask that question about every other single person in the Bible is also absent from the Amidah. In other words, if I was coming up with a list of top 3 worshipers in Jewish history, I might have thrown in, let's say, Moses, he prayed and saved the Jewish people from certain doom and destruction, or King David, who wrote the book of Psalms, according to the rabbis. My favorite one who's missing is Hannah. Hannah is the mother of Samuel, who prays for a son, and her model of prayer, a silent prayer, is one that we actually do when we say the Amidah. Let's say we recite it silently. How come she's not mentioned? Basically, nobody's mentioned. It's just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So why are we starting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in line 2? And not only that, how come we say God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob? What's the reason that we're saying that, even if we're settled on those names, as opposed to repeat, it's a more efficient way in which you just say God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So if you take Kimmelman's approach here, which is, this is a text that is actually just drawn from the Bible, we start to open up possibilities of interpretation that take us in a whole other direction. In other words, it's not a referendum, I'm going to argue, on which are your favorite biblical characters and who's there, who's in, and who's out, but rather it's a hyperlink to a part of the Torah, a part of the Bible, that gives us a different understanding about what we are doing when we stand and say the Amidah. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. I'm going to reshare the screen, and we'll take a look at where that line number 2, is taking us in the Bible. So let me reshare. If you're following along at home, I'm moving on to page 2. So take a look at Exodus chapter 3, which is what I have here on the screen. Exodus chapter 3, I'll read it for you in the English, and you're going to see where we are in the biblical narrative. So God said, "Do not come closer. Remove your shoes from your feet, for the place on which you stand is holy ground." God said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov." Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Okay, so where are we here in the biblical narrative? We are at the scene of the burning bush, right? The burning bush is the moment of encounter, the very first moment of encounter between God and Moses. Moses runs into God at the burning bush, a few verses earlier than what I quoted here. And the very first thing of substance that God says to Moses is the line that we're looking at here, the line in the bold, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So now what we see here is the answer to your question, or an answer to your question of why does it say Abraham, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, is because this is the only place in all of the Torah where God is referred to as God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Elsewhere in the Torah, God is referred to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But this is the only place where God's possessive noun is repeated. And therefore, why it says it this way in the Torah is a separate question, but why it says it in the prayer book, in the Amidah, is to hyperlink you to this scene. So make no mistake about it. You are being taken to this scene narratively, and this is what you have rattling around in your head when you're reciting this line in the Amidah. Now, you can say, well, I still want to add the matriarchs, that's fine, but I'm just telling you how the Siddur works. How the Amidah works is that it's quoting a line from the Torah that takes you to a different narrative locus. Now, what's happening in the scene of the burning bush? If you remember, Moses encounters God at the burning bush a little bit early in Moses' life. I'll stop the share here for a second. It's just the background context. You remember how old? This is a great thing. How old was Moses when Moses ran into God at the burning bush? You remember? It actually says it in the Torah. It's not like, you know, made up as a drasha by the rabbis. It's just straight up written in the Torah. Moses is 80 years old when he runs into God at the burning bush. And this is the beginning of Moses' career. In other words, stop anybody on the street and say, tell me something about Moses. They are not going to mention anything that Moses did in his first 80 years. So I want to tell you, anybody who thinks that they're winding down at the age of 80, people, this is where you're just getting started, okay? The back 40 years is what it's really about, at least for Moses. So this is actually when Moses has lived out the majority of his adult years. And what does he do where is he in his life? Like, what's his resume read like at this moment when he runs into God at the burning bush? Well, if you remember, Prince of Egypt, he grew up in the palace, in Pharaoh's kingdom, as it were, and then ends up murdering an Egyptian taskmaster. That is discovered. He runs away and he moves to a place called Midian, where he settles down, marries a woman named Tzipporah, whose father is Yitro, who's a Midianite priest, and he built a life for himself as a shepherd. Now, that's the place where Moses is when Moses, encounters God at the burning bush. And I think what's so powerful about this is, if anybody here thinks that they are a little bit alienated from Judaism for whatever reason, Moses has got you beat over and over again. That is to say, when Moses runs away if you want to write yourself out of the biblical story and the story of the Jewish people, a great place to go is Midian. Because Midian is neither here nor there. Like, where's all the action happening? It's happening in Egypt. That's where all the Jewish people are. Or it's happening in Canaan, in the promised land, in the land of Israel, where they're all trying to get to. That's the story of the Torah. So Midian is a great place to hide out if you're looking to sort of be in podunk and drop out of Jewish life, as it were. And this is the moment that Moshe is living in when God encounters him at the burning bush. In fact, when God says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, this is not news to God. This is news to Moses, right? Because who does Moses think his father is? Well, he's probably a little confused on that front, right? On the one hand, he does have a birth father named Amram, who he's never had any dialogue with, and was put in a basket when he was a little baby and swept up into the Pharaoh's palace. So he might have thought that his father was Pharaoh. Probably his real operative father is his father-in-law, is Jethro, who's a Midianite priest. He's a great guy and he offers a lot of wisdom throughout the Torah, but he's not really part of the project of Moses' people. And so in that way, God is reminding Moses in this moment, you know who your ancestors are? They are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I was in relationship with them. I am in relationship with you. You have a lineage that you probably didn't even remember or know, and I'm revealing or reminding you about that fact now. Now, if you take this into the question of what I'm doing in prayer, then we can sort of take all the narrative elements of the scene of the burning bush and put it into the moment when I step into the Amidah. When I step into the Amidah, by the way, traditionally you step forward at the beginning of the Amidah and you step back at the end. 3 steps forward and 3 steps back at the end. There are those who connect the stepping forward in the beginning of the Amidah as related to Moses stepping forward towards the burning bush. In other words, we're sort of literally embodying Moshe at that moment, stepping towards the thing of curiosity that ends up being holy. And in that moment, we hear the word of God speaking to us in prayer. That is to say, when I open the Amidah, I'm actually quoting God speaking to Moshe, i.e. me. And that's how you might interpret this line. That is to say, can I listen to the voice of God? God is orienting me and reminding me of my lineage. And not only that, there is a challenge that God puts out in this moment of encounter. If you remember what it is, God says to Moshe, I want you to go to Egypt and redeem the Jewish people, right? You're the Goel, you're the Redeemer. I want you to go and redeem the Jewish people from slavery. And you remember what Moses says in response? No way, no thank you, I can't speak, send anyone else but me. I have no interest in jumping into this role. Okay, and that's something that is also significant from our lives as a worshiper, because we could be standing in front of God and God is speaking to us and even offering us a orienting guideline to our lives and our purpose and mission in life. And we might say, you know what? I'd rather be a shepherd in Midian. Like, leave me alone. Like, I'm not stepping into my future role. And even though you stop someone on the street and they say, tell me something on Moses, they'll never say, oh yeah, Moses was an excellent shepherd. That guy was a fantastic shepherd in Midian. I don't remember what happened to him later on. That's not his story. He's unwilling to step into his story, even though that story is going to define him. And that's, I think, something that we can all potentially relate to as regular humdrum worshipers, which is to say, perhaps some alienation from our people, perhaps some reluctance to step into our life's mission. And perhaps in that way, the Amidah is a helpful tool to allow us to check in on a multi-times a day basis on whether or not we have stepped into our mission, our life's mission or not. So again, you can take or leave the interpretation that I'm putting out here, but what I'm trying to do is show you how very clearly the Siddur, the Amidah, is built on verses from the Torah. And when you bring in those verses from the Torah and their narrative context, you get to have more interpretive fodder to work with as you're trying to build some sort of meaning with these phrases and words. Okay, so that's the method that we're working on here. I'm gonna run us through a couple more lines just so you see how this works. And you know, as you can see, this is a life's project. It's more than an hour, and we could do this for every blessing of the Amidah and every line of the Siddur. There actually were some rabbis in the Middle Ages who did this project. They went through and hyperlinked every phrase of the Siddur to a phrase in the Bible. And so there's a lot of material for us to work through. Thank God we have a very large Siddur, and so we can keep busy at this for a long time. But today what you're gonna get is a couple more lines in the Amidah. Let me just take a moment to look at your chat, and then we're gonna go to the next line here. Okay. What was unique about the first time Hashem tells Moses that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as apart from the other times that he says this? Yeah, well, I think what's fascinating about this as the first time that God introduces God's self in this way, and actually in that scene with the burning bush, which goes on for another chapter and a half, God says the same line 2 more times. So it really is God's calling card here. And in this way, I think is unique to the orientation that Moses experiences at the burning bush, which is to say, this is my personal revelation. Actually, he's on Har HaElohim. He's on the mountain of God, which is the place where the 10 Commandments later is given. And actually, the burning bush in Hebrew, the word is sneh. And that sounds like the word Sinai. So, you know, in English, it doesn't work because bush and Sinai doesn't sound the same, but sneh and Sinai sounds the same. And so in some ways, Moses is getting the one-on-one revelation that's sort of a presage to what the Jewish people is going to get a little bit later. And that's what we're going to see, you know, when the whole Jewish people, you know, gets revelation at the same place. Okay, there's a lot more to say about Moses and the burning bush, but let's jump on to the next line, which always gives people some sort of pause. I'm going to reshare the screen, go back to page 1, and look at the line that says, the great, mighty, and awesome God. I'm going to share in just a second, but just to remind you, we're calling God the great, mighty, and awesome God. And this is something that, again, you know, does God really need me to tell God that God is great, mighty, and awesome? Like, what is God? Does God have an ego that needs to be stroked? That, you know, I need to sort of pile on some adjectives? Am I buttering up God in a way of you know, using these adjectives just to get to the point of the requests? Okay, maybe. Let's see how this plays out. I think that one of the other challenges with this line is you're using human adjectives to describe God. If I say to you, God is great, mighty, and awesome, what do you think God did to deserve the title great, mighty, and awesome? And here we have a lot of possibilities, right? We have, God created the world, or God split the sea, God gave the law. All these things that God does that are miraculous that you and I can't do. That's great, mighty, and awesome. But at the same time, the word gadol, great, is a word that can describe God, apparently, but it also can describe any object. Like, this is a water bottle. It's a bakbuk gadol. It's a big water bottle. How could I use the same word to describe a water bottle as I could use to describe God? Why would I use the same adjective to describe God as I could do for any other object? And so that's sort of a challenge that we're going to look at here. I'm actually going to read a story with you where we're going to get to see a rabbi who reacts to the challenge of using adjectives to describe God. So let me share the screen here. We're going to move on to page 3. Okay, there's, it's nice to get a story about the Amidah. So let's get this story from the Talmud. There was once one who prayed the Amidah before Rabbi Hanina and said, the great, mighty, awesome, powerful, strong, courageous God, right? In the Hebrew, it's Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah. That's the standard text. And he adds, Ha'adir VaChazak VaAmitz. So this prayer leader, this anonymous prayer leader who's saying the Amidah, he decides to double down on the adjectives, right? If the standard text has 3 adjectives, Gadol, Gibor, and Norah, great, mighty, and awesome. So now we have another 3 adjectives, right? Adir, Chazak, and Amitz, powerful, strong, and courageous. So there's some desire, some almost temptation to not stop with 3 adjectives, but to go on and double down on the adjectives. But this is not an approach that Rabbi Hanina, who was in the congregation that day, seems to like. So let's see how he reacts. Rabbi Hanina said to him, have you finished all the possible praise of your master? Were it not that they were written by Moshe in the Torah and affixed by the men in the great assembly, we wouldn't even say those 3 descriptions, right? If it weren't written by Moshe in the Torah, you wouldn't even say great, mighty, and awesome, never mind additional adjectives like powerful, strong, courageous. But you go on saying all of these, you go on adding. It may be compared to a human king who had thousands upon thousands of gold coins, and people praised him for owning silver. Isn't that a terrible degradation of him? Right? So what's Rabbi Hanina's point? Rabbi Hanina's point here is that you think by adding more adjectives, you're doing a service to God. You're actually getting a better understanding of God, a better praise of God. But the truth is, the whole notion of language is silver and God is gold. You are completely mistaken if you think that by adding on more silver, you're going to get to describe gold. It's a category mismatch. And so you might reasonably say, great, I get it. Like, no adjectives, it doesn't work. Don't describe God. So how come, says Rabbi Hanina, how come we even say the first 3, the great, mighty, and awesome adjectives, as opposed to adding any others? Certainly you shouldn't add any others, but how come you even say the first 3? And he says it was written by Moshe in the Torah, right? That is to say, only because Moshe wrote these words in the Torah are we able to dare to say those 3 adjectives in the first place. Now, this is just underscoring the method that we're using here, which was outlined by Reuven Kimmel, which is to say every line in the Siddur has a quote from the Bible that helps us understand what the Siddur is getting at here. So let's take a look at the line that Moshe used this phrase on in the Bible, because Moshe only says this one time in all of the Torah. Moshe only calls God great, mighty, and awesome one time in all of the Torah, and it's right here on Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 17. Deuteronomy is the last book of the Torah where Moshe gives a long, multi-chapter speech. Not bad for a guy who couldn't speak back in the beginning of Exodus. And this is what he says when he uses this phrase. He says, I'm going to read it on the left-hand side of the English, for God, your God, is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, mighty, and awesome God, Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHaNorah, who, now take a look at what defines God as great, mighty, and awesome, who shows no favor and takes no bribe, who does justice for the orphan and widow, and loves the stranger, providing him with food and clothing. You too must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Right? So what does it mean for God to be great, mighty, and awesome according to the Torah, according to the place where this phrase originates? It is not God creating the world. It is not God splitting the sea or giving the law or any number of things that we think of as solely in the divine realm, but rather it's things that are associated with justice. Doesn't take any bribes, right, as a judge, and does justice for the orphan and widow and loves the stranger. And these are things that you and I not only can we do, but we must do. You too must love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So in other words, what we have here is a modeling by God as opposed to an othering by God. If I stop at someone on the street, I say, God is great, mighty, and awesome. Say, yeah, I know. I'm nothing. God is great. I'm nothing. God can create and God can destroy, and that's not really what I can do. But here we get the opposite approach, which is, oh, God is great, mighty, and awesome because God acts justly and protects the vulnerable members of society. And you know what? I better do that too, right? So when I stand up and say the Amidah and I recite the terms, Ha'el HaGadol HaGibor VaHanara, the great, mighty, and awesome God, I could be describing God, but that's kind of a failed project because it's using silver to describe gold. What I might be doing instead is reminding myself that I have a responsibility to take care of the widow and the orphan. I have a responsibility to love the stranger. These are hard things to do. You know, if it was easy to love the stranger, the Torah wouldn't go over it and over it each time. Like the Torah doesn't command you to eat ice cream. That's easy. But loving the stranger, that's a hard one. So you might have to remind yourself multiple times a day that this is something that I need to orient myself and remind myself to do. Now, I'm going to admit to you, it's a subtle art form that the Siddur is using here. That is to say, if the Siddur was just a list of like a holy to-do list, it could have been a little clearer. Oh, like follow your life's mission, line 1, take care of the vulnerable, line 2. But you know what? There's something about poetry that also works for humans where prose and lists don't always work. Jews were never big into a list of credo items, even though the Rambam Maimonides did try to sort of throw that our way. But that's how the Siddur, again, we didn't invent the Siddur, we just inherited it. So the Siddur is operating on a poetic plane where it's taking certain lines from the Torah and allowing you to fill in the blanks. And so in some ways, when I say God is great, mighty, and awesome, what I'm meant to understand, I'm arguing, is the rest of the verse. The rest of the verse is God is great, mighty, and awesome because God takes care of the widow, God loves the stranger, and we also must engage in those relationships as well. That's the sort of challenge that is set before us. Okay, so again, what I'm arguing here is an interpretive method where you can't just read the words on the page and expect to understand what the Siddur, what the Amidah is doing. You have to connect them to the way in which they are brought in the Bible. And for that project, there's a lot more interpretations that can emerge once you go down that road. Okay, I'm going to take a 10-second drinking break. I'm going to look at your chats. Feel free to add more questions if you want. We'll do 1 or 2 more lines, and you'll see how this plays out, okay? All right, I'm going to take a look at your chat here. Okay, so Lee is saying, what is a good source of biblical Siddur connections? So you can take a look at, I'll just put it into the chat. It's on Sefaria, sefaria.org, on the liturgy section. In the liturgy section. And you're going to look for this person here, Abu Draham. Okay, it's all there on Sefaria. Abu Draham, his name was David Abu Draham. He lives in Seville in Spain in the 14th century, and he goes through and phrase by phrase hyperlinks you to the right connection in the Bible. Stephen is saying if you can address the body movements and the posture of the Amidah. Yeah, I'll do that very, very briefly. And I think that It's a fascinating separate topic. Amidah means to stand, and in that way, it's probably meant to be distinctive from other prayers where you might be sitting, like the Shema. The Shema, as you learned in this series, is said, "B'shochbecha v'kumecha, b'shiftecha v'beitecha." When you're sitting down in your house, when you're lying down in your bed, you can say the Shema. The Amidah, by contrast, is only said standing. It's also said with your feet together, which seems to be an imitation either of the angels or the priests. In some ways, the priests are earthly angels. And so that's part of it. And also the bowing, which we've restricted now in current Jewish practice, excuse me, to just bending your knees. Like, can you see my knees? Let's see. I'm not going to stand on my chair, but you bend your knees and bend your back. That's the bowing that we do. But probably originally, there was a full prostration that was involved with the Amidah, where you get down on the ground. And that's something that we do on Yom Kippur. We don't do that anymore in daily prayer, although the Talmud does speak about kings and priests or high priests needing to bow more than regular people. So there's something related there in terms of the body movements and the sort of religious orientation that we're supposed to do. Yes, and I want to also just underline. Safira said that My People's Prayer Book, that is an excellent series, and in that section was published by Jewish Lights and edited by Lawrence Hoffman. And you can see Mark Bretler goes through the biblical sources for a lot of the prayers in that series that you can get as well. Okay, in our last 15 minutes, let's move on to one or two more examples here that we're going to take here, and then we're going to allow you to enjoy the rest of your day. Let me reshare the screen, and we're going to deal with this question of, I think someone raised it in the chat, El Elyon, God Most High, creator of all. El Elyon, God Most High, Koneh, which in modern Hebrew means to acquire, but in biblical Hebrew seems to mean create, creator of all. What does it mean for God to be most high? After all, isn't God like the only, God Most High implies there are other gods who are like medium high, and God is most high. But that's not really, I thought, what Judaism's all about. I thought Judaism was like monotheistic, not, one among many. So it's nice to be the highest God, but why are we calling God Most High if God is unique and alone? So that's one of the questions. And also, what does it mean for God to be the creator of all? How does that fit into our locus here? And it gets back to the question that somebody raised around Chesed of line 5 and 7. If you could actually put them together, that's part of the puzzle we're going to unpuzzle here. So let me reshare the screen. We're going to go to the next section together. I'm skipping page 4 and going on to page 5. Okay, so what you see here in page 5, which is going to help us understand where this line, creator of all, and God Most High comes from, is, and you get this at no extra charge. By the way, the whole thing is free, but like even for more value, you get at no extra charge a version of the Amidah that was discovered in the Cairo geniza. The Cairo geniza is it was brought to light in the late 1800s by Solomon Schechter and other academics at the time. And what they uncovered in the geniza, which was about 1,000 years of Jewish manuscripts that were preserved in the wonderful climate of Old Cairo, in an attic in a synagogue there, was a tradition of the Siddur that comes from Eretz Yisrael, from the land of Israel, which actually kind of went out of style about 800 years ago, and nevertheless was preserved in the geniza. And what you see here is an alternate version of the Amidah that is an older tradition, in many cases, an older tradition of the text that we currently have today. So let's just take a look at it. Notice the overlap with what we've been working with. Line 1, blessed are you, God, our God and God of our ancestors, exactly the same as ours. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, exactly the same. The great, mighty, and awesome God, exactly the same. God Most High, that's exactly the same. But now, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, Koneh Shamayim Ba'aretz, as opposed to Koneh Hakol, creator of all. Then we have some new lines. Our shield, the shield of our ancestors, our security in every generation. And then the ending is the same. Blessed are you, God, shield of Abraham. Now, what's striking about this is there's a little bit that's new and there's a lot that's missing, right? Who's the Redeemer that God is bringing? God, not mentioned here. What about the Gomel Chasadim Tovim and Zocher Chasdei Avot? What about the Chesed, the loving kindness? Totally God, not here. What's actually here? What's here is God is El Elyon Konei Shamayim Baaretz. God is God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Now, that's, if you go back to our original page 1, that's what we have here as line 4, El Elyon, God Most High. Konei Hakol is line 6, creator of everything. What I'm telling you is Konei Hakol is actually a summary. It's like a euphemism for Konei Shamayim Baaretz, creator of heaven and earth. After all, heaven and earth is kind of the same thing as everything, at least in biblical speak. And so what we see here is a little bit of a scramble that happened. El Elyon was a line that used to be connected to Konei Hakol. Line 4 and line 6 used to be grouped, which means line 5 and line 7 used to be grouped. The Chesed and Chesed used to be grouped. God Most High, creator of everything, used to be grouped. And we now have a little bit of a scrambled version in the Amidah we recite today. But that's not always the case of how it was in old times, and not only in Eretz Yisrael, but also in the old Babylonian tradition from the Babylonian Talmud also used to read that way. Let's go take a look at it again. God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. El Elyon, Konei Shamayim Baaretz. That is the way the Amidah used to read. Now, this is important work to do because if you're trying to find out where it shows up in the Bible, you have to get the quote, search for it in the Bible. So let's take a look. Let's search for where it is in the Bible. And here we're going to get the last page, chapter 14 of Genesis. Chapter 14 of Genesis is in the middle of the stories related to Abraham. And what we see there is an amazing moment where a particular character named Malkit shows up and offers a blessing to Avram using the phrase El Elyon Konei Shamayim Baaretz. So let's just notice what Malkit is. Malkit is a king who is not a Jew, right? Abraham is the only Jew. Abraham is the only follower of Yud Hey Vav Hey. Malkit is a good guy. His name means king, righteous, and he rules a place called Shalem, like peace or wholeness city. But he's not part of the Abrahamic tradition. And nevertheless, he's going to use a name for God of El Elyon Konei Shamayim Baaretz. Let's read this selection just so you can see it. Now, the scene takes place in this moment when Avram finishes a war in which his ally in the war was a guy who was the king of Sodom. Now, the king of Sodom in the Bible is not a good guy. His name actually is Bera, which means evil. His name is King Evil. So King Evil is not a guy you want to hang out with for that long in the Bible, especially if you're Abraham. So Abraham is about to divide up the spoils of war that he gained by being allies with the king of Sodom. But here we have Malkit is going to show up in the middle of this scene. So let's read it. When he returned from defeating Chadar Laomer, when Abraham finished defeating the kings and the other kings with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet Abraham in the valley of Shaveh, which is the valley of the king. Okay, they're about to divide up the spoils of war. Now, out of left field, here comes Malkit. And Malkit, king of Shalem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. Hu Kohen le'el Elyon. He was a priest of God Most High. You know why it sounds like El Elyon is like one of many gods? Because that's what Malkit was. He was a priest in a world in which there were idol worshippers everywhere. That's the whole setup of the place. He got into a very good priest school. Okay, his parents were very proud. He's going to the priest school of El Elyon, God Most High. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other gods. Of course there are other gods. That's what it means to be an idolater. Okay, he's a priest in El Elyon. Now watch what happens. Malkit blesses Avram, saying, Baruch Avram le'el Elyon konei shamayim baaretz. Blessed be Avram to God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. That is the line that we are using in our Amidah. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your foes into your hand. And he gave him a tenth of everything. So what happens here is Malkit, right before Avram is about to divide up the spoils of war with King Evil, Malkit, King Justice, shows up, gives Avram a blessing, says to Avram, you're blessed to God Most High, El Elyon, Konei Shamayim Baaretz, creator of heaven and earth, which sounds a lot like, and in fact is the old version of our Amidah text, which says, El Elyon Konei Hakol, God Most High, creator of all. Now, if you think that Melchizedek, like that's the end of his walk-on part in the Torah. He's gone. That's it. He's done. Now we get the scene where Avram and Sodom finish up their negotiation around the spoils of war. Watch what happens. Then the king of Sodom says to Avram, give me the people and take the possessions for yourself, right? Okay, let's divide up the spoils of war. I'll tell you what, I'll get the slaves, you get the stuff, we're good. But watch what Avram says. But Avram says to the king of Sodom, Harimoti Yadi, I raise my hand and swear to Adonai El Elyon Koneh Shamayim Baretz. I swear to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the personal, Jewish God of Abraham, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. I will not take so much as a thread or a sandal strap of what is yours. You shall not say, it is I who made Avram rich. I'm not going to go down in history, says Avram, being the beneficiary of the spoils of war from my alliance with the king of Sodom, King Evil. I'm going to take nothing. You can have everything. And I'm making serious by making an oath to Adonai El Elyon Koneh Shamayim Baretz. This is an amazing thing, because what Avram did in the space of 3 verses is he took the line that Melchizedek innovated by saying God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and he just tacked on Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh right before that line and made it very Jewish, okay? That is an amazing move. He doesn't innovate. He does innovate in that he combines something new, but he doesn't come up with the line El Elyon Koneh Shamayim Baretz. He just borrows it from Melchizedek, King Justice. Now, I think what's powerful about this, if we're going to take this into our Amidah, is, everybody was bothered by the fact that there were a lot of missing people in the Amidah. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're all there. But what about Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah? I'm bothered by Hannah. You're bothered by David. I'm bothered by everyone. Nobody said, where's Melchizedek? Why isn't he in the Amidah? But you know what? He is in the Amidah. We are quoting him word for word. El Elyon Koneh Hakol, which is just a rephrasing of El Elyon Koneh Shamayim Baretz. Yes, Shalem, the rabbis read that as Jerusalem. El Elyon Koneh Shamayim Baretz shows up in our Amidah. So we are quoting Melchizedek. We are quoting a righteous non-Jew in the middle of our Amidah. And not only a righteous non-Jew, literally his name is King Righteous. We are quoting Melchizedek, who also reminds Avram, and this is a great interpretation by Julie and my joint teacher, Judy Klitzner, who says that Melchizedek reminded Avram that he should not take any spoils of war from King Evil, the king of Sodom. And that's the turning point for Avram, where Avram has the courage to do the right thing, to do the ethical thing, the moral thing, stand up and say, I'm not taking any money from you, and instead say, you're not going to go down in history saying, I made Avram rich, my money is dirty money, I took it from King Evil. No, that's not what's going to happen. And King Justice, Melchizedek, is the sort of the spur to allow Avram to say that, even though he's not part of the Abrahamic tribe or family, which Genesis is really into. And so in that way, what we have here hidden or not so hidden in the Amidah is an opportunity to learn from our righteous non-Jewish neighbors and teachers how to behave morally in the world when faced with a tough decision. Abraham left money on the table. He's a wandering nomad guy who doesn't have a ton of disposable income, but nevertheless decides not to take money from the king of Sodom. And so, again, whether you take this interpretation or not, what I'm offering you here is just a way of understanding how the Amidah and in general the prayer book works. The Amidah quotes lines from the Bible. Sometimes you have to do a little work to find the line. And in that way, it allows us to interpret in different, I would say, different levels of depth, the lines that we often say when we pray. Let me just take one more look at your chat in our last couple minutes here, and see if we can. Okay. Yeah. Dan is asking, is Elohim, well, does that presuppose there's some sort of plural nature to God? And there's a lot of scholarly debate about that, where you might say, yeah, originally maybe Elohim, and there are some moments in the Genesis story where there's a plural verb used with God, where that might have been a composite nature of God that gets unified in one God, Adonai Echad. but maybe have some sort of like original pluralness to it. Yeah, people are asking where could we learn more together. Again, if you go to hadar.org, then you'll get. I actually teach a morning class every morning at 7:45 in the morning on the Amidah. 15 minutes on the Amidah. We're going through the Amidah line by line and doing a lot of this. So if you want to do more of that, you're welcome to. It's been a pleasure and an honor to learn with you here, and so grateful to My Jewish Learning for the opportunity. Hope this opened up the Amidah and this particular blessing of the Amidah in a deeper way. And look forward, I'll be teaching later on in this series about the Kaddish. So we'll have an opportunity to learn again together then. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Julie for goodbye.
For announcements. Thank you so much, Rabbi Elie Kaunfer. This was so wonderful and fascinating. And we very much look forward to seeing you again. I just want to let everyone know what that date is. It will be May 4th. That's, I believe, in 2 weeks from today. Yes, 2 weeks from today, same time, and Elie will be teaching on the Kaddish. So be sure not to miss that one. And we do have another one in the series next week. Let's see. I forgot to double check on that one. April 27th. So 1 week from today, we will be looking at the Lecha Dodi with Joel Hecker, who also taught about the Kiddush. And we will send out tomorrow a link with all this. There's a page on My Jewish Learning. It was in a previous email, but we'll send that again. A source sheet, a page with all the source sheets and the recordings. Once this recording is up, we'll send out that follow-up email. And I'm glad everyone is so jazzed, as it says in the comments. Definitely check out Hadar, hadar.org. You can find all of their teachings on their website, Elie's and lots of other rabbis at Hadar who are teaching. And I definitely encourage you to go to that 15-minute Amidah class as well. So we'll see you next week. Thanks again.